So hello everyone and welcome back. Again, we're having some technical difficulties, but let me go ahead and restart. This is 5 and 25. My name is Lauren Flores and I'm joined by my colleague Cindy, and she'll say hello in just a second. But we're going to do our 5 and 25 stream. And what we do in 5 and 25 is we find 5 words that are current in the news and we talk about them and define them. And I'm going to take a second and let Cindy introduce herself. And it might take her just a second to pop in. So what I'd like to do is, since we're starting a little late, I'm going to go ahead and get started. If there's anybody here and you have any questions, Cindy's going to be monitoring the chat. And
yes.
Also, you can ask us questions afterwards. And so it sounds like you're here, Cindy, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Yes, I am. Unfortunately, I cannot see the video in the chat. I mean, I can't. Yes, I'm here, but I'm here, but I can't really see the video through the YouTube the channel that I'm in. I'm not sure if it's a technical difficulty.
Well, we'll just go through, and what I'll do is I can describe a little bit what we're talking about. So let me go ahead and get started with our first word. That would be insurrection. And it's going to take me just a second to get to that page. And hopefully y'all are able to see the page that has Merriam-Webster. And there we go. So Merriam-Webster is one of my favorite dictionaries. They have a lot of really good content. We're also going to show you content from Credo Reference, which is a database that the library has. So it's very excellent because it has a lot of encyclopedias and dictionaries, and some of them are really specific to certain topic areas. So if you need to get really detailed information, they're really great for that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the definition of insurrection, at least in Merriam-Webster, and we're going to go look at Credo in a moment because sometimes dictionaries have slightly different definitions of words. But the definition that Merriam-Webster gives us is an act or instance of revolting against civil authority or an established government. And I'm going to move over to Credo and do a quick search there so we can see And it's interesting because Credo Reference really seems to equate insurrection with rebellion. It talks about different insurrections. There's a little area on the side on Credo that will show a little word diagram. And I've got it displaying on the screen, hopefully y'all should see. So you'll see there's some related words like belligerent, insurgency, revolution. So you'll see that, insurrection is a word that seems to be a strong synonym for rebellion. And one thing that I wanted to mention is there is an Insurrection Act, so I'm going to pull that up on the screen.
Just quickly, is there a difference between, so insurrection is worse than rebellion? I'm not sure because I can't see.
That's a really good question. Let's look at that really quickly. So I've got the 1807 Insurrection Act up, and I just wanted to mention really quickly before we go and examine the word a little more closely, that if you are interested in actually looking at the text, I found it by searching online. If you go to government sites, they will often have laws and things like that posted. That's where I found this. I believe I found it from like a military site. So if you see .gov, that's your signal that that's coming from a government site. But let's switch over to Merriam-Webster. And it'll take me just a second. And Cindy was asking about how it's related to rebellion. So we're going to look really closely at the Merriam-Webster definition. So it does have a list of synonyms, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, Cindy, because it's really helpful. It talks about insurgents, insurgency, mutiny, outbreak, rebellion, revolt, revolution, rising, and uprising. So it does seem to be related to those concepts. One of the things that's really good about Merriam-Webster as well is they'll have recent examples from the web, and it's really useful to see how people are using that particular word. And I think we're ready to move on to the next word, but I wanted to check in with Cindy and see if you have any more comments or questions.
No more questions. I'm just kind of treating it as a podcast. I can't really see any of the visuals, but it's very interesting.
Gotcha. So let's move on to our next word, which is coup. And there we go. And so the word is coup or kudeta. That is French. It means like a blow or a strike at the state. And I'm going to show really quickly the Merriam-Webster version or the definition that they use. And let me navigate to that particular page and do a quick search. And there we go. So it is a word that we borrowed from French. And if you look at the Merriam-Webster definition, it's a sudden decisive exercise of force in politics, or the violent overthrow or alteration of an existing government by a small group. And it's a pretty old word. It looks like the first time that it was used in 1646. There's also some synonyms for this particular word that we borrowed from other languages. One of them is from Spanish. It's golpe or golpe de estado or even autogolpe. It has the same meaning. You might see it in news articles that are talking about events in Spanish-speaking countries. The interesting thing about autogolpe, it's a little bit different. It's a violent overthrow, but it's usually meant to keep a leader that's already in power still in power. So it's kind of like a self-coup, I suppose, would be one way that you could phrase it in English. There's a third term that people use that's also similar. It's called Putsch. I hope I'm saying it correctly, but it's coming from German. And I'm going to show you really quickly the Merriam-Webster version because it does have there's a little bit of history to that particular word. And let me type that in. So it's slightly different for this particular word. It is referring to a secretly plotted and suddenly executed attempt to overthrow a government. And I think in the United States, we're most familiar with the putsch or coup attempt that happened in the 1920s, and that would be the one that Adolf Hitler was involved in. It looks like this particular word is quite a bit more modern. It's from 1919. And I'm going to let Cindy talk a little bit about the word, or if you have any feedback that you'd like to add. That makes sense. And actually, the image that I found to illustrate this concept is from 1973 in Chiles. I'm glad that you mentioned that. It looks like we are coming up on time to move on to our next term. That term is sedition. So I'm going to go back to Merriam-Webster and we'll look at their definition for sedition. And their definition talks about sedition as being an incitement of resistance to or insurrection against lawful authority. Now, if you go to Credo, and it looks like Credo is not working, so we might just skip over that part, but let me try one more time. Okay, so that looks like that's not working, but we can just move along. One of the things that I wanted to mention about sedition is that there is some historical, I would say, occurrences around sedition. Of course, there's a Sedition Act. And let me pull that up so we can all look at that. So you can see that there's also a famous politician from the 19th century that we can talk a little bit about named Eugene Debs. And that's what he looks like. And so he was really involved with labor unions, and he ran for president in the Socialist Party as a candidate in 1900, and I think several other elections in the early 20th century. And he's one of the few people that was arrested for sedition. It happened in 1918. And he was an opponent of the war, and so that was the main reason why he was arrested and jailed. But this is an image of Eugene Debs and his running mate in, I believe, 1900. And I'm curious what you have to say about this, Cindy. Yeah, it's almost like people have really forgotten him, which is really unfortunate. So I'm hoping that, this might spark some people's interest to go and read about him, because the more that I find out about him, the more interesting he seems. I mean, he seems like he was very, very unusual for his time. So I think it's time for us to move on to our next term. So I'm going to go ahead and unveil that. And our next word is Orwellian. And again, we're going to consult Merriam-Webster. And so you'll see that the description on the website is talking about relating to or suggestive of George Orwell or his writings. And really, when they talk about Orwellian, they're really being specific. It's really relating to the novel that he wrote called 1984. It was a dystopian novel which if we want to revisit or visit that particular word, dystopian is having to do with an imagined world or society in which people live fearful lives. So it's the opposite of utopia, where everything is ideal and perfect. Dystopia usually is, a frightening, dangerous, scary, futuristic world. And 1984, the novel, was incredibly influential in the English language. There are a lot of words that we use that come from that particular book. But this particular description, I think, is a really good encapsulation of what Orwellian or Orwellianism means. It isn't about big government, it's about authoritarianism coupled with lies. And that was something that Gordon Bowker wrote. And actually, I think Cindy had a thought that she wanted to share with us. That's really interesting. I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I did pull up our library homepage, so we do have a lot of material that he wrote. 1984 is not his only novel. He wrote a lot of other novels and a lot of social commentary. I did want to put an image. This is Big Brother. He is the totalitarian dictator in 1984. So if you've ever seen the movie or read the book, you might remember the famous slogan, Big Brother is watching you. It's like a surveillance state type of thing. This is an image of George Orwell. His real name was Eric Belair. And he did work for the BBC. So he had a lot of really good ideas. If you ever get a chance, he wrote a really good article about politics in the English language. And he talked about the ways that the English language could be used as a propaganda tool. So I highly recommend it if you have a chance. And I wanted to check in with Cindy and see if there was anything that you wanted to add before we move on to our last term. Thank you so much. And I actually have a picture of the cover. So I think that one is a little more allegorical, is my understanding. But again, I agree with you. I think that's a really good book as well. And I'm moving to our last word. So let me arrange the screen a little bit. It is riot. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to get to Merriam-Webster so we can talk about what a riot is. So here's the definition of riot. Riot is a violent public disorder. It specifically refers to a group of people, so 3 or more people, that are assembled all together and are more or less misbehaving in public. And so there's some other ways that you can use riot. I mean, you could use it figuratively to mean something that's really funny, or if there's like a profusion of something like a riot of color. But more or less though, it really does refer to disorderly groups of people, more or less rampaging. And I'm doing a quick search because there's a related phrase in English called Riot Act. And that's usually if somebody is reprimanding you, and it has its roots in the fact that there really was a riot act in the 18th century in England. And so if there was an assembly of people and they were starting to behave like they were going to riot, the law officers would read the Riot Act, and if they didn't disperse after being read the Riot Act, then they would move in and start arresting the people in the mob. So if you hear someone saying that they've read the Riot Act to someone, it just means that they've reprimanded them or warned them. One of the things that Cindy and I found out when we were researching this particular word was just the variety of riots that have occurred in our history. And one of them we thought was pretty entertaining, and so we're going to share it with y'all. But in the early 1920s, there was a riot that had to do with straw hats. And I'm going to go to the Wikipedia page because they do actually have a really good page with a lot of information on what exactly happened with this particular riot. And this is the Wikipedia page. It just explains that it happened in 1922, so it was almost 100 years ago. It happened in New York City, and it lasted about 8 days. So that seems like a lot of ruckus just about straw hats. And really, what it boils down to is back in the early 20th century, people were a lot more formal with their dress. And what they would do is they would wear hats. And so I'm going to show you an image of what a person at that time would look like. So something like that. So this gentleman has got a straw hat. And one of the things about wearing a hat at that time is there were social conventions that governed when you could wear certain types of apparel. So the Straw Hat Riot was referring to the fact that at that time people were supposed to wear straw hats past September 15th. So it's kind of similar to the rule that you might have heard about not wearing white shoes after Labor Day, but people took it very, very seriously. And if you notice, this is an ad from the time. Men had the choice of either wearing straw hats or felt hats, and so this is just kind of an image so you can see what they look like. But really what started the riot was a group of young men that saw other people that were wearing straw hats past the time that they should have been, and they went after them and started pulling off their hats and smashing them, and it started violence. One of the most amusing parts about this particular incident is that there were younger men that were in this particular riot. And so some of them were young enough that when they were arrested, the police called their parents and had their parents spank them in the police station. And I'm going to stop for a second and let Cindy talk a little bit about this.
I don't know too much about the spanking. I just know that hats were very important. You couldn't leave the house without one for a while, and they fell out of fashion, so it's hard for us to relate. But there's an idea that they fell out of fashion because JFK did not wear a hat.
Right, and that makes sense. It's really important, I think, to society when celebrities either start a fashion or they do away with a rule like that. It really does affect the rest of us. And in this particular case, a couple of years after this riot happened, the president at the time, which was Calvin Coolidge, he actually went outdoors in late September wearing a straw hat. So for all intents and purposes, people really stopped paying attention to that particular rule. And do you have anything else that you'd like to add, Cindy?
No, I think you've covered all of it.
Awesome. Well, I'm not sure that there are any folks waiting or if they have any questions, we can circle back and just have a look and see. But I did want to mention that if y'all have any questions, you can always go to the library homepage. We have a place, and you'll see the link on the bottom of the page where you can ask us questions online. You can also call us at 210-207-2500. And I'm going to do a really quick check and see if there's anybody in chat.
There's nobody in chat right now.
Okay. So I wanted to thank everyone for coming. Again, we're sorry for the technical difficulties, and we really appreciate y'all coming to watch our stream. And hopefully we will see you again. And actually, I was going to quickly ask Cindy, when is the next one scheduled?
I believe it's March 9th.
Awesome. Okay, so it will be the same time at 7 o'clock, and there'll be a link to the stream. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you so much, Cindy, for being part of the stream and being a co-host. And I'd like to thank everyone else, and we will see you next month.